Good evening and welcome to the Art Deco Society UK's webinar with myself, Karen Harvey. We're very excited to have you all with us tonight. I'm the Art Deco UK Northwest rep and your webinar host for this evening. I know that we're all eagerly awaiting Emma Bastin's fascinating talk, but I just have to go over a few house rules before we get started. The first thing to say is that we now have auto-generated captions, which are available if you click the CC live transcription button on the bottom of your screen and then show subtitles. Now, as this is in a webinar format, which is different from a regular Zoom meeting, you can only see the panelists, me and Emma, but we can't see or hear you. So feel free to relax without having to worry that anyone can see you in your pajamas. We've already discussed that, haven't we, Emma? We're not in our pajamas. We'll also be following up the presentation today with a Q&A session, which you can either put in the chat box or ask Emma any questions in the Q&A logo, which is also at the bottom of the screen. Emma will be sharing her screen presentation with you as she goes through it. As always, please be respectful and thoughtful with all your questions and comments. I think we've got 37 people now, so we'll get a move on. That's it for the house rules. We'll move on to the part that you've been patiently waiting for. Emma, we're very excited to welcome you this evening. And if you'd like to start us off with a bit of bio about yourself.
So I am currently working on my PhD and I'm looking at the consumption of rayon, which you may also know as artificial silk, in the interwar period. I started doing that really because I love sewing and I love history, and I was just drawn towards the fashion illustrations of the 1920s and 30s. So when I was hunting around for a subject, this is what I fell on. As well as doing my PhD, I've got a couple of children, so I've been running around after them until about 5 minutes before we started. And I also help run a children's clothing bank. I think that's pretty much it. And I love Art Deco, of course.
Thanks very much, Emma. So if you'd like to launch into your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awaited.
I'm just checking that you can see my screen, Karen, as well.
I can, yes.
Excellent. Yes. And hopefully everyone else can as well.
I'll keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A for you.
Thank you. I am actually really delighted to be here. I've loved Art Deco for a long time. And as I said, doing textiles in the interwar period led me down various rabbit holes, and one of those was Art Deco that kept coming up again and again. So I joined the Art Deco Society about 2 years ago, and I've been joining most of the talks since then, and I'm finally doing my own. So fingers crossed you find it interesting. It's certainly got some nice images and things in it, so do enjoy. I will start by looking at some textile and fabric and clothing advertising. Then I'll look at how Art Deco was used in trade exhibitions. We'll do a little bit of shopping, 1930s style, and then we'll wrap up looking at some fabrics and garments themselves. Something to bear in mind as I'm talking is that actually Art Deco and fashion and textiles go really well together. If you consider that one of the central tenets of Art Deco is that design aesthetics should and could be united and and mass production should and could work together. And you really see this in the age of mass production of textiles. I can't move my screen on. There we go. I'm going to open with probably the two most striking of the Art Deco adverts that I came across in this period. So it may feel a little bit downhill from here, actually. These two adverts come from a trade journal. And you can see how striking they are in themselves. The Raphael Besso one on the left, it really stood out because it's got a black background with white text, which was incredibly unusual. But you also have this very striking woman with her rolls of fabric. And on the right, the Beversheen advert it's quite an early advert. I think it dates from the late 1920s. And it's very striking in its simplicity, hardly any text on it, but also for the fact it's in colour, which it is very unusual for the period. So one of the reasons that these are some of the most striking Art Deco advertisements at this point is because manufacturers were slightly worried that the British public wouldn't quite get the avant-gardeness of Art Deco and the modernity of it, and they didn't want to scare them off. One critic has called this medieval modernism that was designed for a cosy, insular England, and this is a lot more of what we'll see as we're going forward. This is quite a good example of medieval modernism, as it's called, the mix of the traditional and Art Deco. So we obviously have this lovely Oriental inspired Art Deco lady at the top on a slightly old-fashioned telephone, but then we also have the heraldic imagery, the Courtaulds sort of shield on one side, which absolutely draws, if you look into this a little bit more detail, it absolutely draws from all the traditional heraldry, although it was made up by Courtaulds. It's quite text heavy as an advert still, which was very common in the earlier 20th century. And of course, we have this sort of handwritten effect, very swirly writing. So this is a real, this encapsulates a lot of the textile advertising at the period, a real mix of the modern and the traditional. If we look at Britain as a whole, it was obviously an industrialized nation, and there were lots of factories and textile mills, and until the 1920s, they'd really been portrayed much as this factory. Arrow Mill is portrayed here. It's very detail heavy, a sort of very realistic rendering. But in the 1920s and 30s, rayon manufacturers in particular wanted to demonstrate that they were producing a new modern material that was really looking to the future. And so this is a new factory built by British Bemberg in 1932, and this is one of their adverts showing their new factory, which is about as far away from the idea of a dark satanic mill as you can imagine. It's bright, it's white, it's got these cretonne style windows, and what they're really saying here is, we can build a factory this good, imagine what our product is like. Another rayon manufacturer, British Celanese, had actually built their factory in 1916, so it's a little bit older than the Bemberg factory. But again, they're using modern styling to illustrate the factory, even if it does have quite a few smoking chimneys. Their Art Deco sort of masterpiece in terms of buildings was the Celanese house on Hanover Square in central London. This was their HQ. And it was a very modern, square and blocky, but in this illustration as well on the right, you can see that they've even illustrated it in a very modern form as well. This building is actually no longer there. It was demolished in 2017 as part of the Crossrail development. But of course, textile manufacturers weren't just advertising their factories. That's not really the interesting part of a textile. Across the 1920s and 30s, we see textile manufacturers really pulling on high-end fashion illustration for inspiration. So in Britain, France and the US, magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar were using artists like Helen Dryden, Robert Bonfils and Eduardo Benito to create these more abstract and symbolic illustrations of fashion. So here is an example from Vogue in June 1930 by Eduardo Benito, and it really epitomizes everything you'd want in an Art Deco image. You have this very stripped back, angular lady with a sense of movement, again with the background as this suggests movement, and of course the Art Deco dog, which reappears again and again. And then in 1933, we have this front cover from the Draper's Draper's Record, which was by Ferguson Fashion Fabrics. And they are very much drawing from this Vogue cover. We have the lady who has the dress that's sort of blowing in the wind. Her elbow is out, again, to give a nice angle to the human body. She has the dog, of course. And actually, if you look at the background as well, you'll see that the clouds at the back are sort of blurred in the same way as the Vogue cover. Now, I can't say that this was an exact copy, it was a conscious copy, but it does really illustrate how manufacturers were pulling on these high-end illustrations. Another example showing Art Deco inspiration here is this another Ferguson's advert. I've got the statuette by Otto Purtzal from 1920 that shows this beautiful dancer in the middle of her dance, and also Paulette Duval from Gazette du Bon Temps, and not only moving but also in a very similar style dress to the Ferguson's advert. Dancers were incredibly important in Art Deco illustration because they had this movement and vitality that was so important, but it was also still slightly provocative. If you think about what the Ballet Russe were doing in the 1920s, this was a new form of dance, and it really was still fairly risque. The other thing that this Ferguson's advert does, which appears again and again in textile adverts over the period, is use this overblown fashion or design on the skirt. So this is almost not a full scale necessarily rendering of the fabric design, but it really shows the detail, which of course on a real dress wouldn't look anything like that. But this had come from an illustration technique that was started by Paul Eribe in about 1909, where he created a stenciling technique. And there's an example, not by him, but this is a 1924 example where you can really see at the bottom the oversized fabric appearing on this dress. Again, it's nothing like you would have seen in real life, but it really illustrates the fabric. If you remember this Ferguson advert with its two dancers, we move on to repeat figures. The central statuette here is the Demeter Kyparis statue, which is sort of the high-end version of this, and it was used by textile manufacturers to really sort of, I don't know, it shows a mass-produced quality. These women are identical in the two adverts, and also the individual woman is elegant by herself, but when you double her up, she almost sort of trebles the elegance in the advert. I'm not quite sure how that works, but for me, it really does emphasize the elegance. You'll also see on the advert on the left that the oversized fabric makes its appearance again. And it also references cruising, which of course was cruising and Art Deco go together hand in hand, really. Curves are another important Art Deco motif, and in the centre here we have a 1927 Roger Broder's advert, Mont Blanc, this beautiful curve with its text really drawing your eye into this beautiful alpine scenery. So that was in 1927, but by the mid-30s, the two adverts either side were appearing in consumer magazines, so women's magazines, because people have become a lot more visually literate over over the 1920s and 30s. And some people have put that down to the posters that Frank Pick commissioned for the London Underground, because so many people were seeing this modern art, and they became adept at sort of interpreting it. But the curved text really slows your eye down and forces you to read the advert more, as well as looking incredibly modern. Another way of textile manufacturers showing off their modernity, and this isn't necessarily Art Deco, but it's certainly modern, is through the use of photography. And obviously this was a technical advance in terms of producing the photographs and also printing them. And you can see that these these mannequins are posed like film stars. And that was a very deliberate move on the part of textile manufacturers, with millions of people visiting the cinema each week to see what the stars were wearing. This is a sort of easy way to draw in your consumer. And so not only do these models look like film stars, actually the backgrounds of these photos, particularly the one on the right, look like movie sets, such as Cedric Gibbons would design, that we saw actually a couple of months ago in another talk. This is an interesting photograph in that it shows the raw material of rayon, which even I have to admit, as a rayon obsessive, is not particularly sexy or exciting. But the black and white photography here really elevates it. So you have the very bright white of the rayon on the bobbins and the long shadows that are cast by it. And this, for me, is really reminiscent of sort of Sternberg and Dietrich films, and the lighting used in things like Shanghai Express. And it gives it a sort of glamour that you wouldn't expect of a raw material. And it also emphasizes again the mass production, and the tagline itself on here says that the yarn is a perfect modern standard of exact uniformity. Another motif or trope that was really popular for textile manufacturers was the beach holiday, which had been popularized by the elite going to the French Riviera in the 1920s. And by the 1930s, the middle class were really jumping on board with this, starting to visit the RC site themselves. These adverts really show off the body beautiful. They are very glamorous, and they are definitely more French Riviera than Skegness, I would suggest. If you look closely at the Courtaulds advert on the left, you will see another dog, which is a theme that runs all the way through. The Ferguson's advert again has this oversized fabric designs on the dresses. And the Sandoz advert is actually an interesting one, because this was in a trade journal, and it's a chemical company advertising dyes to textile manufacturers. So actually they have no real need to show off their fashion credentials. And they're, but they really are in this advert. I love it, but I do find it quite a surprising move on their part. And if we take a look at the women that you've seen illustrated through most of these adverts, you will see what Lucy Kitchen has called the puppet lady. This is an illustration. These are illustrations of women who are very blank, reduced, stripped back right to the bare minimum, really. They're slightly robotic in look, I suppose. And by the mid-1920s, they were so ubiquitous that Jean Paquin actually used mannequins in this style to show her garments at the 1925 Art Deco Expo. So you may have seen this image before. British textile manufacturers didn't really catch on to this idea until she first appeared about 1927, but by the 1930s, she was everywhere. She's incredibly glamorous. She offers a glamour that you just can't get on a real face, apart from very rare exceptions. But she's also a canvas that allows women to project themselves into that situation. and imagine wearing those clothes or being in that room or whatever. So she's quite an important and striking character. Another thing you can't fail to have noted through all these adverts is the huge variety of fonts that were being used, that definitely pulling on Art Deco traits. So the most famous fonts in this period were things like Broadway by Fur, Gill Sans, that had been designed in the late 1920s by leading font artists, but these were reinterpreted by various advertisers to create their own fonts, and they were not shy about using them. So this is an advert that uses 4 or 5 different fonts, all of which are fairly striking in themselves, but the idea here seems to be just throw whatever you can at it and hopefully someone will like something on it. Very similarly to this, Courtaulds, the big rayon manufacturer in the period, used no less than 26 different fonts for their brand name Courtaulds between 1933 and 35. So it really shows that there was no sort of real awareness of a brand identity through font at this point, and they were really still experimenting. It's quite unusual. This is quite an unusual advert in that it's only font and text, and that is particularly unusual in the textile and fashion area, because of course you normally want to show off what you're producing and make it look fantastic. But as I mentioned before, the public were becoming more aware of what these different fonts meant, and there's a wonderful quote from Advertisers Weekly that says something along the lines of, the public don't want to be insulted when they see a font on your advert. They want to feel like you understand that they're modern and forward-looking, so use a font that suits that. And this really screams modernity, but it is very, very unusual. And I think because Celanese had despite there not being a brand identity, Celanese at this point did have quite a strong brand going, so it was much easier for them to use just text. If we move on to trade exhibitions now, so trade exhibitions were a way of showing off the goods that a nation produced. They had really taken off in the late Victorian period, and they were still going strong in the interwar period. The first drapery exhibition was held in 1908. There were cotton trade shows, wool trade shows, women's fashion wear shows, textile machinery shows. There was pretty much something for everything. And in 1926, the first artificial silk or rayon exhibition was held. And right from the outset, the organizer was determined that this was going to be a very modern trades fair. And they employed an eminent team of architects, quoted, to design the fair itself. And you can see from this publicity on the screen here that they did go for absolute modernity. On the left is the cover, as the picture of their cover from 1927, the brochure with this very stylized sort of catwalk show. And on the right, we have an image from 1929, and you can actually see a little bit more detail on the background or above the door where the models walk out. And again, it's very striking in Art Deco. And all of the stands were designed like this as well. They were very stripped back. Some people thought to the point of austerity, but they did show off the fabrics incredibly well. In 1932, the various textile industries actually came together to form the British Textiles exhibition, which was part of the British Industries Fair, which was the main trade fair at that period in Britain. So that included rayon, of course, cotton, wool, silk, linen. And you can see in this, this is a poster, and they've taken Britannia as their mascot, and they've really stripped her back. So she looks quite a lot like a puppet lady, certainly compared to the image of Britannia we get on the coinage of the time, which is much more detailed. This fabulous illustration is a cover from the souvenir brochure from 1934. And for me, it looks like you're going to walk into a beautiful cinema or glamorous theatre. Actually, the exhibition this year was held at White City, which was now 30 years old and very much unsuited to holding a trade exhibition. It was described as just being a series of long corridors that you had to walk along. But this sort of sets out what you would meet inside. And inside, despite the poor layout of White City, it was very much Art Deco. This is actually from 1932. These images, the architect throughout the 1930s for the British Textile Exhibition was Joseph Emberton, and he was particularly involved with the fashion theatre. And if you look behind the models, you can see the background that they were working with. So it's very stark, geometric. The railings on the centre right photo to me very much suggest cruising. On the far right as well, I have this beautiful curved staircase, again with its sort of chrome railings. This is on the left is a picture of the fashion theatre as well. And you can see it's got this beautiful curving walls of the staircase with a white walls and a dark carpet as contrast. For me, I have to just add at this point that staircases were incredibly common in fashion parades at this point because they added this extra sort of dimension to allow people to see things as people normally walked out of the main door. For me, it's very reminiscent of the Hollywood musicals as well. So I've got this picture here as well from The Gay Divorcee with Rogers and Astaire, and you know they're working on the same principle. It adds elevation and height and a different perspective. You may also, if you're beady-eyed, have noticed that there is an aeroplane at the top of the stairs on the left. Again, it shows the sort of the desire to be modern and glamorous. So the model actually climbs out of the aeroplane and then descends the steps. And as we know, it's modern transport loved a bit of Art Deco, and Art Deco loved a bit of modern transport. They both go together. The other thing that happened with these fashion shows were that they were filmed by Gaumont and Pathé, and they were actually shown in cinemas across Britain. So not only would people see these modern fashions, but they would also be exposed to this Art Deco styling of the sets as well. The exhibitors themselves also went for a bit of Art Deco styling. So Courtaulds were, as I mentioned before, the largest rail manufacturer in the UK at this point, and they were a flagship British company, so their stands were always very impressive. The stand from 1936 is a fountain which was spraying what is best described as fabric fluff, if I don't go into too much technical detail. So you can sort of see it looks a bit sort of bubbly on the fountain in the middle. And you can also make out in the top, there are some coloured lights. So this fabric fluff was lit up with different coloured lights, which was apparently a very attractive effect. But the stand itself, of course, is, you know, is pulling in all the Art Deco sort of themes here. It's very geometric. It's got these decorative parallel lines and wonderful curves. It looks like it's made out of very pale material. And in 1937, they had an equally striking looking stand. This one told the story of colour, which is a very grand thing to try and do. They had a laboratory that you can just make out in the centre of it, which showed off their modernity. And there are some lovely details on this. There are the half orbs on the top of each column, which echo the globe that sits on top. The sort of curved pier that sticks out to the front and gives another lovely dimension. And you can also just about make out on this that there are the classical detailing at the top of each of the columns, and that's echoed on the columns on the stands on the left as well. If we move on to doing a little bit of shopping now, in 1925, the editor of a textile trade journal said that Shopping for fabric and clothes has become a social function, and shopping excursions have become a definite part of women's life. Another author said that shops were gleaming palaces of fashion and fabrics. So here I've put on a couple of examples of Marks and Spencer's gleaming palaces. This is obviously the Marble Arch store on Oxford Street, which is currently slated for demolition. Marks and Spencer's were doing incredibly well at this period, and they could afford to invest in building or rebuilding their stores to make for a pleasant shopping experience. And this Art Deco styling definitely made the store stand out from the outside. So that's the Marble Arch version. And then here is a sort of miniature version built in Brixton in 1931. And like Marks and Spencer's were really forward looking when it came to the consumer experience in terms of what you experienced when you went in there, into the store as well, and also their low price point. And in an era before the real mass production of garments, they sold 1 million dresses in 1930, which is quite an achievement. So it shows that they were obviously doing something right. And if you didn't have a brand new building, Art Deco building like M&S, you could always entice people in with your window displays. This is clearly not a modern window display. This is a window from the early 20th century. And the aim at this point of a window display was shove it in the window and make the consumer think that we probably stock the item we want. It's not a very attractive look to our eyes. And in the 1920s and 30s, this look started to slowly vanish as people took inspiration, or as retailers took more inspiration from department stores, and window dressing itself became more of an art. So this, I apologize for the terrible photo of this image, but this is a book dedicated to the art of draping, which told you how to drape fabrics in window displays and in stores. I mean, it's an absolutely beautiful cover, and it really screams that it's going to show you something glamorous. And here are some examples of that draping, fabric draping and window display in action. I'm not really sure you can call this Art Deco draping as such, but it's certainly very modern. If you look at the background of the displays, they are probably more what we can term Art Deco in terms of the shapes that they're using and the colours. And the image on the above right, I suppose, with the spotlight on Ray, and again draws from cinema. You can see the mannequins are posed with their arms out and the things, which again give a shape to the body. And the fabrics themselves look as though they've been measured down to the millimetre to create these repeated forms and shapes. And the pleating as well is very reminiscent of ancient Greek tunics or the Mario Fortuny gowns of the same period. And once you are inside, you might encounter something like this. This is D.H. Evans, which is a high-end department store, or was, sorry, a high-end department store on Oxford Street. So this is not your typical retailer, but you can see how stripped back this interior is. These beautiful, almost like floating islands have replaced the tall, heavy cabinetry that shop assistants used to access, where you would ask for goods, and they look to be made out of, these islands look to be made out of something glossy with their dark edge detailing. The clothes themselves are almost stark in their presentation. If you can actually though just make out on the right of this photo what I think are rails of clothes that the assistant probably would have got for you. But in terms of viewing the clothes in the as you walk in, it certainly makes for something very exclusive looking when it's set up like this. So if we turn to some fabrics now, I apologise for these images on this slide anyway being in black and white. They've all been taken from various trade journals. The idea is really to show you the design, not necessarily the colour. Because yeah, there's very little colour printing at that point. most of these fabrics were continental in origin, those produced in the UK. It was seen at the time that the British were not particularly good at textile design. They weren't able to create anything modern or stylish. And in fact, this was such a big concern that in 1935, there was actually a design commission set up by the government to try and work out how to improve the quality of textile design in the UK. In the meantime, though, big textile manufacturers such as, or printers such as the Calico Printers Association bought their designs in France. They would then have them reinterpreted by a team of designers based in the Calico Printers Association in Manchester, and temper the sort of avant-gardeness of some of the French designs for a British public. They did this based on guesswork and also what had sold the previous season. So there was never anything too shocking in the collections. Another company that did this, whose adverts we saw before, was Ferguson Fashion Fabrics. And they also, quote, adapted the latest designs from Paris. So in the 1920s, fabrics were quite plain to go with the very simple silhouettes and shape of the garments, if you think of a typical flapper dress, for example. But by the 1930s, printing techniques had really improved, as had dyes, and the shape of garments as well allowed a smaller, more intricate patterns to be put on them. So geometrics were particularly popular in the mid-1930s, and again, these are sort of the geometric sort of thing has this very Art Deco look. These are some more sort of novelty fabrics. Some of these come from the V&A collection, and there's some wonderful things here. The sort of mustard one on the lower left is obviously calling it a like nautical theme, and it's very angular. You have this wonderful lady on a red sea balancing somehow on this lilo/surfboard thing. My personal favorite here though is the penguins. Sort of fashion fabric. I don't know what it was, but I would like to think it was inspired by the new penguin enclosure at London Zoo, although I have no reason to suspect that really is the case, but I love it. And if we move on to look at some garments now, just as textile printers were great at stealing textile design, they were also pretty good at stealing garment design, or borrowing it and reinterpreting it. In my PhD, I looked at how what the garments that appeared at the British Textiles exhibition were very close copies of those garments that had appeared in Paris about 9 months earlier. This probably seems like a long delay in terms of passing on a fashion idea, but actually at the time it took about 2 years for a fashion to trickle down from Paris to the general public in the UK. So this 9-month turnaround is actually quite a quick turnaround. So here are some examples. We have the Vogue illustration from 1926 with the uneven hem, shows the pearls and the ribbon detailing on the dress, which is then copied by Simpson and Godley at the British Textile Exhibition in 1927. So I think that's the Artificial Silk Exhibition in 1927. The V&A dress, dark and white contrast, is flipped over in the Baroque version of 1933. The waist sash has also been moved up to be a scarf, but it's still incredibly similar. The Jean Patou dress from Vogue in 1932 is almost directly copied by Marcel in 1933 in terms of the fabric pattern and the shape of the gown. And on the right, we have a Mambocker version of what we now call the Letty Linton dress, after Joan Crawford wearing it in the film of the same name, with these enormous ruffled shoulders, and it's reinterpreted by Whitworth and Mitchell in 1933. But this Letty Linton dress, I haven't illustrated that dress itself, but it shows how fashions were really zooming around the world at this point, from Hollywood to Paris to London, and they were all sort of, it was becoming more global. But interestingly, at this point, the British, when these garments were shown at the mannequin parade at the British Textile Exhibition, there was always the idea that it was British designers showing off their genius. There was never any mention of Paris or any other influences. It was always British designers producing these goods or these dresses. Now, just a quick look at some details and some sort of extant dresses that are in various collections. This image is taken from Vintage Details, a fashion sourcebook, which has some amazing images of close-up details of dresses. This is a linen dress from 1927, made in England. I suspect it's been hand block printed. If you look at the whole dress, it's a fairly bohemian, sort of Bloomsbury-esque sort of dress, but it has some really wonderful Art Deco detailing on it here. And then these are some other details. So the beading on the right draws from Surrealism and Schiaparelli's use of giant bows in the late 1930s. This dress dates from 1939, and the detailing on the beading is fantastic. It actually runs along the neckline, this bow. It's very stylized. The central dress obviously has this beautiful zigzag beading across the middle, and on the right is a Kaiosers dress that I found earlier today. It's actually for sale on Etsy if you have, I think it's about £2,500 to spend. I am not selling it. I just I'm not plugging it for myself, but again, it has this wonderful sort of detailing on it that's incredibly Art Deco and striking. And then a few things that actually come from British museum collections as well. As there's a fabulous quote from a critic called Elizabeth Wilson, and she says that fashion acts as a vehicle for fantasy, and I think in these next garments you'll really see that. So this is the front of a dress from the 1920s. This is beaded on a piece of silk, and that's how it's manufactured, on a large piece of silk. The beading was put on, and then you would cut out this frontispiece and attach it to a dress. The owner of this obviously never did it, but you can see the beautiful sort of it's mirrored on each side. You have the waist detailing, which for me is almost Egyptian. And also, if you look up at the neckline as well, you see this sort of, I think it's two rows of, it looked to me like pearls running down with a faux pendant, which again is very Chanel with her costume jewelry. So it's pulling on a lot of sort of fashion themes here. The image on the left is from the Bristol Museum. It's a silk velvet dress with these beautiful sort of arcs up the bodice that are again all beaded, and it has this beautiful Art Deco buckle as well. So even if a dress itself wasn't necessarily Art Deco looking, you still got these amazing could still get amazing buckles and dress clips with lots of geometric and glittery detail on. The Fapper dress in the centre is from the Museum of London. Again, very intricate beading on this, and you can just about make out the geometric patterns on it. And again, the sort of double zigzag effect at the bottom of the beading. And the cape on the right, I don't know whether you can really call this Art Deco or not. I'm going to class it as Art Deco just for its glamour and scale. It's something you can imagine a starlet owning, but actually it was owned by a Mrs. Tinney who who hoarded clothes basically in the early 20th century. It's likely she never wore this outfit or this cape, but it is magnificent. That just about wraps up my talk, but I'll leave you with this final advert from Ferguson. because I think it contains all the Art Deco elements you would want in a typical Art Deco advert. You have the puppet lady, you have this bold graphic font, you can see some of the details on the fabric as well, and of course, once again, we have the lovely Art Deco dog. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope it was interesting.
Thank you very much, Emma. It was wonderful to see that cape. If you just want to go back to that slide,
Yeah,
because we've actually seen it in the flesh.
So far it's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, and having read the history of the lady in question, she was part of an exhibit just before lockdowns, an English lady's wardrobe, and trust me, she hoarded so bad that she had the staff take the deliveries to the back door rather than the front door, so that her husband didn't know that orders were coming in. And a lot of this was on display there, and we were all swoon on the floor at it. But also on display were a lot of items where the tags had never actually been removed. So she veritably was the first shopaholic.
Yeah, no,
era.
she absolutely was. I have to say, I also visited the exhibition and reviewed it. And the catalogue by Pauline Rushton, I think, if you're interested in clothing of this era, is definitely worth buying. It's absolutely beautiful. And actually, because the collection is so interesting, they actually do exhibitions fairly frequently. So I'm sure there will be another one in the next few years.
Yes, well, we were kind of waiting till after the pandemic. I'm called on as the Northwest rep, bit of a plug for the outings here.
Yes.
So, I was called on as the Northwest rep because I have a propensity to make friends with the fashion curators at the museums of the Northwest. And my home city is Preston, where less so about it being rayon, it's all about cotton.
It is.
And the Horrocks's collection at the Harris. Now, unfortunately, the Harris is undergoing renovation until next year now, but we've had a couple of private organised talks at the Harris. And we've got proposals for a nice big one on reopening next year, which we're going to make an Art Deco one. And basically, we've tentatively named it the Downton and the Durrells fashion talk, because we can dive into the archives with the fashion curator Caroline Alexander at the Harris, and it'll be a wonderful opportunity. They love
Sounds fantastic.
us all sort of like dressed up to the nines and things like that. I think by the end of this year, because we have to wait till next year for the Harris, I think we should try and make friends with the curator at Liverpool. We've done ones at the Port Sunlight one, as well as in the one in the centre of the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. So there's plenty of opportunity.
Yeah,
mostly for the ladies, less so for the men, I think.
Yes, definitely. As always in
the archives, in some of the fantastic fashion museums we've got in the Northwest. So just turning to the questions now. We have a few from Charlotte. I'll start off with the first. She was commenting that it's so striking that the Vogue and Draper's record cover models were Black women. Was that common at the time?
It's not, but there was this idea of exoticism.
Josephine Baker, I presume.
Yeah, Josephine Baker and Nancy Cunard as well borrowed a lot of African details, as she used to wear bracelets and things up to her wrists. So it was something that was very stylized. There is another I think it's another Cortels or Celanese advert where there is this enormous statuesque woman who's and she's just trying to think. I'm sure she's a lady of color as well, with a very tiny man at the bottom sort of trying to propose to her or something. It is very striking. It's not common by any stretch of the imagination, but it does appear to sort of pull on these exotic themes, a little bit like Orientalism was also pulled on, like in the very first Courtaulds advert I showed. It's sort of, yeah, we'd call it cultural appropriation, but it didn't strike people as that at the time.
Thanks. Another one from Charlotte has asked, was it common at the time to produce printed fabrics in multiple colourways?
Yes, I have just written about this, and it really was. Yes, you could use up to, profitably, you could use up to about 6 colours on a print, and they would, gosh, I need to dig my chapter out, I've forgotten. But it was common to run up to about 10 different colourways, but you needed to produce actually vast quantity for cheap fabric anyway. You needed to produce vast quantities and lengths to turn a profit. So they were quite reluctant almost to use as many colours as they could, but also to reuse the designs. Not that the designs themselves were particularly expensive. It was more the getting it engraved, and then all the ink and the factory process. So you would normally have about 10 different colorways on a popular fabric.
It was interesting that Charlotte should ask that question, because my grandmother was at Salford School of Art in the 1930s, and she did a number of fabric designs herself, and I saw, obviously influenced by what was around at the time, that not only, as you mentioned, were the designs simple and geometric, but also and Mancunian born and bred she might have been, and therefore looking at economics of being able to afford to print these kind of fabrics in the north of England at the time. But they were tricolour, they were no more than tricolour. Yeah. Was that also, I mean, obviously you could produce up to 6 to 10 mixes of colour if it was a more expensive fabric, but was the Art Deco aesthetic in textiles much more, like your black and white images? You got to see the Technicolor adverts, but as the fabrics themselves, did they tend to be 3 colours, or did they become more so towards sort of like the end of the 30s, maybe?
I think it's from existing. It's tricky to work out, to be honest, because we have a few sort of sample books that show what manufacturers were making up with very small snippets of the fabric. And then we have some extant garments that are still floating around, but a lot of the photographs we have are, of course, in black and white. So it suggests that manufacturers were trying to use as few colours as possible, obviously, because at this time as well, they're really trying to drive rayon manufacturers anyway. We're trying to drive down the cost of rayon. So you could buy a yard of fabric for 2 and 11. So it's pretty cheap. But of course, to do that, you do have to limit the colours that you can go for. And I think these geometric designs actually, yeah, they did work a lot of the time in either black or white, or in very, very simple sort of just 3 colours was enough, because the graphic style of them was sufficient. And a lot of fabrics also came on dark backgrounds anyway. So discharge printing was quite popular, where you sort of got rid of the colour on top and the background was very dark.
That's great, thank you. Charlotte's also asked, the Museum of London heavily beaded dress towards the end of your talk looks almost Native American. You've talked about sort of like the African influence, and obviously we had the Egyptian influence in the 1920s as well. Was Native American art and craft a reference at the time in the 30s?
I've only looked at the UK, and as far as I mean, not in the UK, no. I just don't think there was any real awareness, to be honest, of that. It may have been in America, but again, fashion influences were so sort of, they pretty much all came from Paris. So it was whatever Paris was exposed to, really, that then would filter through. So I think a lot of, yeah, I mean, there's the Orientalism, a little bit of African influence, and the ancients, particularly Egypt in the early 1920s. But I can see what you, Charlotte, means about it looking sort of American Indian. It actually does, but I don't think it was it was supposed to be.
You just touched on, Emma, about the printing process, and that leads quite well into Lorna's question, which is, were the patterns in the late 20s and 30s printed rather than woven? And if so, what influence did it have on production and consumption?
So dress fabrics tended to be printed, unless they were particularly extravagant sort of evening fabrics. A woven fabric was much harder to design and was more labor intensive to produce. So the way of producing cheaper and lighter fabrics, because don't forget at this period, women are going for much lighter dresses. They sort of either hang very straight in the 1920s or they cling to the body in the 1930s. So they're looking for quite a flexible, light fabric to be able to do that. And that needed something to be printed. And of course, it helped keep the cost down. And I think it did encourage consumption. We're reached in the 1920s and 30s, fashion is appearing in magazines and newspapers. Women are encouraged to buy more and more. The middle classes have more more income that they can spend on things like fashion. And so it definitely does affect consumption, particularly when you consider that people started to want beauty before durability. So there was very much prior to this period, clothing really did have to last you a long time, unless you were an elite who could afford to keep renewing your clothes. By the 20s and 30s, particularly with the advent of this very cheap rayon, clothing starts to become disposable for the first time. I mean, it's in no way like fast fashion today, but you start to see that process beginning.
Thank you. I quite mirror Emma's question next, which is, do you know if the Pathé films of those fashion shows survived?
I do, because I have seen one, and I think you can see them on their website. I couldn't use an image from it though in this presentation because licensing it is so expensive, even for a frame. So there are definitely films. I think it's Pathé that still exists, and I can't remember which archive it is. If you maybe tweet the Art Deco Society, I can have a look and see if I can find a link for you if you would like to have a look. But there are quite a few fashion shows in various film archives. They're never very long, but they are interesting.
Smashing, thank you. Question from Duncan. Whereabouts was the British Bemberg factory, and does it still stand?
The Bemberg factory was in Doncaster. I don't know whether it still stands or not. I would guess not, because the textile industry has taken such a battering. And it's quite, I mean, you saw on the advert, it's quite an iconic building. It was quite, it was advertised quite heavily at the time. I think we'd probably know about it, as you know, if it did still stand, but I don't think it does.
Thank you very much. Question from Gina is, do you know where the term medieval modernism comes from?
I do. It's a critic called Anthony Blunt, and I can't remember when he wrote it. My head is just full of facts and figures that I can't actually reference. And he wrote a whole piece about medieval modernism. Again, if you want to tweet the Art Deco Society, I can send over more details.
Smashing, thank you. Kirsty has come in with a little interesting little bit of information on, and as an answer to the Native American question.
Oh, yeah.
And that there were definitely campfire girls learning Native American crafts in the UK in the 20s, as her grandmother did in Glasgow. So there was some awareness of it via travelling shows, etc.
Yeah,
so
I guess there was.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, actually that's true, because the sort of the Wild West show of the 1890s had brought Native Americans over, hadn't it, as well. So there was certainly awareness, but whether it, you know, that's interesting, because it's sort of the Campfire Girls sort of plays into this the outdoors and body beautiful idea as well, doesn't it? And hiking and all these things. Yeah.
So many influences,
Yeah.
architecture discoveries in that through the 20s and the 30s that you can see that there's a lot of opportunity for textile artists to take their influence from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't there? Yeah. Well, thank you. That's been a wonderful presentation, Emma. There's been a lot of thank yous and in the question and answers.
Thank you, everyone.
A lot, you know, Charlotte especially, she said it's a wonderful talk, and there's been a lot to whet the appetite, others have said, and thank you for the beautiful slides. I have to concur. It's the only thing now is to remind all our attendees about the future talks that you can see and can be pre-booked on the Art Deco site. Just to tie up, Emma, you're in the final year of your PhD now, aren't you? Looking forward to the end of the journey, I presume.
Yes. Yes, I am. So I've been doing it part-time. So
with the family, obviously, yes.
Yeah. So it's been a 6-year journey, but doing it part-time means you can dip in and out if you want to, but actually I just get so completely engrossed in what I'm doing. It's like this Art Deco thing. It's taken out a whole lot more research outside of my PhD, but actually I love it so much.
Smashing. And the finished project, will it be available to read? Are you thinking about publishing it in any form?
I don't know at this point. I think probably a wider history of rayon would be sort of not just covering the interwar period, would probably be a more publishable option. But yeah, I don't know. I'm certainly interested in doing something with it, but yeah. And if you really want to wade through a PhD, of course, it will be published on the British Library's ethos page as well.
Smashing, thank you. There's certainly enough of us fabric or textile nerds out there that have been absolutely fascinated by your talk and experience and knowledge. So thank you very much, Emma. And
thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody else for coming as well. Don't forget, you can find the tickets for upcoming events on ticketsource.co.uk/Art Deco Society UK, with dashes between each of the words. So thank you very much all for attending this evening. Stay safe and well, and that's all for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.